Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third session on para-athletics training. Our presenters today are extremely experienced, and we're very grateful to have them here presenting, and for their knowledge. It's a huge benefit to all of us. So our two presenters today are David Weicker, who's a WPA educator. He's a technical delegate and ITO, and also a member of the International Panel for Chief Photo Finish Judges. And then in addition to David, we also have Jerry Clayton, who's also a WPA educator, a technical delegate, and ITO from the USA to help present here. So they're going to go through their presentation. There will be some breaks in the presentation for questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. And when we get to those slides, I can ask Jerry and David for the questions, and then we will get some answers, and we can have follow-ups at the end as well. But thank you, Jerry and David, and go ahead.
Thanks, Anthony.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. So what are the objectives of this session? I'm not sure how many people are on yet, but what we're trying to do is give you the tools that you might need as track and field officials. And this particular session is relating to track officials, and it's to give you an understanding of the athlete flow, and it's in major competitions within para-athletics track events. Secondly, to gain insight into different rules applying to different sport classes within the call room and the field of play. And thirdly, to give you some context of what happens after the event, so the post-event control center, and also to talk a little bit about the technical information center and the call room. Okay. So what is a post-event control center? Well, it's simply where, and it's, as it says, post-event is the place where all athletes go immediately after completion of their event or events, where the athlete pick up their accreditation, and it may be their sweatshirt or their bags that they have left in the call room. And it's a place where they find out about victory ceremonies and drug testing or doping control. It's important to note that coaches and team managers are not allowed in the post-event control center. But the technical delegate and the track referee are, if they need to go in and look at something. So what is a technical information center? It's a place where athletes, coaches, team managers can get technical information about the specific competition, including all forms required for requesting anything. That is anything like assistance that's not already included with the sport class, protests and appeal forms, etc. Now, it's important to note that TICs are becoming more remote access as COVID has progressed, and you will see a few things that have changed as a result of COVID-19 in the presentation. Okay, Jerry, next slide. So what is a call room? And I'm not going to spend much time talking about the call room because you're getting a whole presentation by Jennifer Campbell at some point. I believe it's April the 6th. And the call room is the place where athletes go to check in for their events, where all inspections of things like wheelchairs, of helmets that athletes are wearing, that MASH or maximum actual standing height is measured, and other throwing frames are inspected, etc. Coaches and team managers, again, are not allowed in the call room once the competition has started. So they may go there in a tour of the facility in advance of the competition, but once the competition starts, they're no longer allowed in there. Okay, Jerry, next. And the purpose of the call room is to make sure that all track and field athletes are competition ready. It is the only time where they are under one roof in a secure area. And it's important to note it's part of the field of play, and all athletes must abide by the rules and regulations of the meet. And some of those we're going to talk about a little bit later. It's the first point of contact at a competition venue after the warm-up facility. Now, it's important to note that athletes can be DQ'd if their equipment doesn't meet the rules and regulations for the sport class and the event. So, for example, WPA Rule 6.16 specifically talks about non-compliance on equipment, yellow card on the first offense and a red card on the second. So if they show up with a wheelchair that doesn't conform, then they get a yellow card on the first offense. And if they don't have it fixed by the next time they're entered in an event, then they're DQ'd. And this is to ensure that they're not just leaving an event because they don't want to run or wheel in that particular event. Okay. Call room staff and duties. And I mentioned before that COVID-19 has changed both the size and functions or duties of call room staff, and they will likely change. You will need more space in a COVID-19 call room. You will likely have less judges and volunteers, and you will likely be working with a different timetable or schedule of events. And you will likely have less athletes depending on the type of meet. Okay, next, Jerry. Call room personnel are responsible for taking track athletes to the start line with the event heat sheet and anything else that they might have, like approved assistance forms for the start line, and they go with the call room personnel. And usually there's one person who leads and one person at the end of the line who's taking the athletes to the start line. So there's nothing different there from able-bodied. Okay, Jerry?
Talk about assistance.
Okay, assistance could be in the form of setting starting blocks in certain races. That's the most typical, and in some cases, assistance could be for guide exchanges in 5,000 meters or 10,000 meters, which is allowed. But I think if the guide exchange, it's important to note that if a guide exchange is determined to be valid, i.e. they're going to make a guide exchange, they declare they're going to make it. But if they don't make it, then the athlete is disqualified. Okay.
Would you agree that the key point there is that the call room person leading them out hands this information over to the start assistant, and that includes all those forms and stuff that may be pertinent to the start or the finish, right?
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right, Jerry.
Thanks, David. We're going to take just a quick moment to talk about classification. Some of you have worked with parasports a little bit, and you know that the athletes are grouped together in homogeneous groups, essentially to make the competition fair, such they all have similar levels of functional impairments. Quickly, the visual impairments are the T and F 11/13s, the T being track and the F being field. In general, for these classifications and the numbers that you see, the lower numbers are those individuals with more significant impairment. So an 11 would be totally blind, and 13 would have a visual impairment, but does have some visual acuity and can navigate on the track a little bit. Intellectual impairments are the TF20s. These individuals are evaluated by a clinician to get a judgment on what their intellectual disability is and the extent of that disability, and that places them in this category. The TF31s through 34s, these are the seated classes for individuals with movement disorders such as cerebral palsy, or they might also have a brain injury that puts them in the class. So all these individuals, men and women, are either in a racing chair or in a seated field chair, or sometimes you'll see them racing in a regular chair, but not at higher level elite competitions. The TNF 35s through 38s, so we're still in the 30 series. These individuals are the ambulatory members of the CP and brain injury group. They're coordination impairments that these individuals have. And you look at a T38, and sometimes you can almost not be really sure that they're actually disabled, but they've had a physical exam and they've been watched during competition, and indeed they qualify to be in that class. TF40s to 41s, short stature, you might have heard the term dwarfs. The 40s are shorter than the 41s. A TF42 through 44, these are lower limb affected athletes, limb deficiency or leg length, impaired range of motion or impaired muscle power. They don't wear prosthesis, they still have their lower limbs. And you compare that with the TF61s through 64s, these are also lower limb deficiencies, but these individuals have had amputation either above or below the knee, and they wear a prosthesis. The TF45s through 47s are upper limb affected limb deficiencies, and it ranges from missing an entire arm, coming down the arm to the elbow, and then down to the wrist. And there are different ways of classifying those, but these 45s through 47s essentially can run pretty normally, but we all know having use of the arms really adds something to be able to accelerate down the track. So they do have a functional limitation in their ability to be able to run. And briefly, we'll mention frame running, or you might heard of it called race running. This is for the lower level CP athletes that have significant difficulty in being able to stand and ambulate. But these devices, and we'll show you one here in a moment, actually allow them to kind of leave over on a seat, and it looks like a tricycle with big wheels on it, and they run. They have their feet on the ground, but this three-wheel device actually provides them some stability and allows them to compete. They're going to be called 71s through 72s, but that probably will not take place until after the Paris Paralympics in 24. Questions? Fair amount of material. Hopefully it was somewhat straightforward.
So there was one question in the chat about yellow and red cards in the call room.
Yes.
Is it within the same competition? Like,
yes.
So, but not the same event. So you'd have to know that somebody had gotten a yellow card.
Yeah, and it is documented and set, and it winds up on the sheet for the next round. So okay. If an athlete comes in and the frame of their wheelchair is too high off the ground, okay, the athlete by rule is responsible for their own equipment. So he's coming in with deficient equipment. The first time they do that, they get a yellow card. They don't go out onto the field to play because the equipment doesn't meet the rule. But they get a yellow card, they don't get a red. If they come in at a later event during the competition and something else is wrong with their chair, or the chair is still too tall, or some other piece of equipment is in error, again, that rule that says their personally responsible for all of their equipment. That's the second time this has happened. And then the responsibility of the call room referee would be to issue a red card. And that would be the end for that athlete. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think the important part is the distinction between event and competition.
Yes.
Competition is a number of events. So the Canadian Championships is a competition, but the 100 meters for T11 to T13 or T11 to T12
Mm-hmm.
is an event
Yeah.
within that competition. Okay,
Very
and
good.
any other questions?
That was the only one that's in the chat right now.
Okay. If there are
Sorry,
no more
David.
questions, we'll carry on with this.
All right, there you go. Finally got it fixed.
Okay, and in the call room, it's important to note that athletes in T11 must wear eye patches to cover their eye cavities, regardless of whether or not they have eyes in their eye sockets or not. And they must also wear approved opaque glasses or an eye mask. Now, it's important to note that athletes are responsible for providing their own eye masks and eye patches, but it's not uncommon for the call rooms to have eye patches and spare eye masks in the call room for athletes who don't have them. It's not the responsibility of the meet or the LOC to provide them, but some still do. T11 athletes must run with a guide, and they must use a tether, and they must use it properly. And the guide cannot finish before the athlete. And we'll show you some pictures of these in a few minutes. So this is the eye patches. Next slide, Jerry. Yeah, eye patches on the left and the eye mask on the right. So again, the call room judge and the chief call room judge are responsible for checking to make sure that athletes have appropriate eye patches and eye masks, and they must wear them leaving the call room through to the end of their event. Okay, next slide, Jerry. And tethers, I think the next slide is going to show an image of a tether. Yep. So this is, so the black part is called the holding loop. The red part is called the locking mechanism, and the yellow part is the part that's 10 centimeters, where the distance between the two stoppers. And it's important to note that if a tether breaks in a race, the athlete is disqualified. And it's the responsibility of the athlete to ensure that their tether is durable and serviceable. Now, it's also important to note that the maximum length of the tether for track events is 30 centimeters. And for off-track events, the maximum length is 50 centimeters. So it can be longer for off-track than on the track. Okay, Jerry, next slide. For T12, the difference between a T12 and a T11 is that a T12 has more function or more sight, and they may run with a guide. But if they run with a guide, they must use a tether, and they must use it properly. And the guide, again, cannot finish the race before the athlete. And the guide, this is for tethers, the guide and athlete cannot release the tether until both have crossed the finish line, i.e. they've reached the vertical plane of the finish line. And again, we're going to show you some pictures a little bit later of this. Okay, Jerry? So what do you watch for in a T11, T12 race? Well, the guide can set the blocks for the athlete and it's permitted. And usually the guide does set the blocks for a T11 athlete. And the speed at which the pair enter the blocks will be longer than expected for able-bodied athletes because they can't see or the athlete can't see. The guide hopefully can see.
Yeah.
Not all of them have very good eyesight, mind you. Non-guided T12 athletes take less time and are allowed to have an assistant to set their blocks if they need an assistant to set their blocks. And usually that's a starter's assistant. It's not usually a coach or anyone from the stands. But if it is someone from a coach or an assistant from other than a starter's assistant, they have to leave the field of play once the blocks have been set. For guided athletes on echelon starts, the guides in the outside lanes will observe those in the inner lanes to ensure that the outside pair are not on their marks too long. It will be a judgment call on behalf of the starter as to how long is fair and that the athletes are not delaying the start. So as starters, this is something that you look for regarding issuing a conduct warning. Okay, next slide, Jerry. Other considerations, it's important to note that the only lanes used for T11 and T12 are 1, 3, 5, and 7. And of lanes 1, it's 1 and 2. Lanes 3 is 3 and 4. 5 is 5 and 6. And 7 is 7 and 8. And of those two lanes, the athlete and guide can determine which they want to use of those lanes. The same rule applies to T12 athletes who decide not to run with a guide. So they still have two lanes and they can decide which of the two lanes they set their blocks in. It's common in echelon starts for both set of blocks to be in even numbered lane to let the athletes have the correct approach into the bend. And you'll see again a couple of images of starting in T11, T12 races. Okay, Jerry, next one. Again, to reiterate, lanes 1, 3, 5, and 7 are used. And even if it's a 9-lane track, it's still 1, 3, 5, and 7. And it's 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8. And a T11 or T12 athlete will never use lane 9.
David, isn't that also the way the start sheets are coming out as? They'll say 1, 3, 5, and 7. They won't talk about the even numbered lanes.
Correct. They'll only show 1, 3, 5, and 7, the start sheets. And often the start sheet will show the athlete in 1, 3, 5, and 7, and the guide will be in on the outside of the athlete. And
But they don't have to be.
but they don't have to run that way. They can run any way they want. Now, it's important to note that they are a team. If one makes a mistake, for example, a false start, the team is disqualified. So the athlete is disqualified even if the guide false starts. And both the athlete and guide, if used T12, must use starting blocks connected to a start information system in bigger competitions. And the start information system will be used in our national championships this year in June. If either the athlete or guide runner runs out of lane on the track on a curve section before the break line, then the team could be disqualified. And there's more to discuss about running out of lane a little bit later. Okay, Jerry, next slide. And here is where we talk about the new rule, which is wheeling or stepping on the line is not a DQ if it occurs only once in a race or in a multi-round event. And secondly, if no material advantage is gained. And third, it's recorded in the results and the start list for the next round if it occurs in a multi-round event. So it's recorded as an L or a lane violation. And the second time wheeling or stepping on the line is a DQ. Next, Jerry. Okay, for races run completely in lanes, so a 200, 400, for example, wheeling or stepping completely over the line is normally a disqualification. Some part of the foot, shoe, or wheel must still be in contact with the line, or it's a DQ. And sometimes it's difficult to see this as an umpire, but nevertheless, we have to rely on umpires if no video recording of the event is being held. For races not completely run in lanes, so for example, an 800 meters, or it could be a 5,000 or 10,000, and if no material advantage is gained, one step on or over the line is not necessarily a DQ. Okay. So here's an example of a start consideration for a visually impaired. You can see what's circled there are lanes 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and 5 and 6. And you can see the line, the start line is extended. And this looks like it's for an 800 meters because it's a white line with a green mark. And the only error in this image is that the start line is extended with red tape and it should be extended with white tape. And therefore, starters assistants may want to have some white tape in their kit or get white tape from the host organizing committee.
Cases of it.
Okay, Jerry, next one. And then there again, the athletes, you can see them starting. And here you can see they're starting in a what looks like a 400, but it could be a 200. So 1 equals 1 and 2. You can see that the lane is extended in 1 and 2, but that's not too hard to do. 3 and 4, the lane is extended in lane 3. In 5 and 6, lane 6, the start line is extended out. And 7 and 8, you can see it's extended out as well in lane 8. And in all of these cases, the guide appears to be, well, on 3, 5, and 7, the guide appears to be in the inside, and in lane 1, the guide is in the outside and running in lane 2. Okay, next slide. And this is again, you can see the blocks of the athlete in lane 7 are set on the line, which divides lane 7 and 8. And this is perfectly acceptable. And you will notice that athletes effectively have 2 lanes in which to put their hands, which is a little different than the World Athletics rule, which says an athlete must start completely within their lane. And in fact, it's not a violation for a T11 or T12 athlete to have 2 lanes. So therefore they can have their hands in both lanes if they so choose. And you can tell this is a T12 event because first off, they're not wearing eye patches or gauze patches or masks. And secondly, there are no guides. So for any of the athletes, there are no guides. Okay, next slide, Jerry. Other considerations for the start, we say it's linked to technology. So unguided T12 athletes must have their correct starting blocks in their lane and linked to a start information system where used. And we are using, as I mentioned earlier, a start information system for our national championships. So athletes who are T11 and T12 must use the technology or the start information system. So it must be set up and set up properly.
David, does that
Yeah.
mean that the starting blocks that the T12s would use would be the ones assigned by the SIS to the odd numbered lanes?
Yes, that would be correct, Jerry.
Okay, thank you.
So technology providers at major meets are likely to post only the athlete's reaction time on the large screens in the stadium. They don't often, you will not often see on a Jumbotron the start information system results or the reaction time for the guide athletes unless there's a problem and the couple is disqualified. So a T12 athlete, again, may ask for assistance in getting the correct lane for the athlete. The international starter and start referee come into play here if there is an international starter. But if there isn't, then it's the start referee or the referee designated to watch the starts. Some companies have issues when the guide is in lane 3 and the athlete is in lane 4. Together, we have fiddled this to ensure the correct reaction time appears for the athlete. Okay. Again, just to reiterate what you're watching for in all track events is running or wheeling out of lane on a curved section of the track. In races run completely within a lane or those that start within lanes. Obstruction of another athlete is also something you're watching for. Abandoning a race is something you're watching for. And the finish of the race, the athlete has to finish before the guide in T11 and T12. A T12 if the T12 is running with a guide. And the reading of the axle of the leading wheel in a wheelchair race or a race runner races is how you determine the finish. And again, an athlete and guide may not release a tether before both finish the race. Okay, Jerry, I think we're going to see a couple of images next. Or coming
Almost.
soon. Yeah. So also, again, running out of lane It's a new rule in world athletics as well as world para athletics. Wheeling or stepping on the line is not a DQ if it occurs only once in a race or multi-round event and no material advantage is gained. And if it happens, it's recorded in the results and on the start sheet for the next round. And if it occurs in a multi-round event, it's marked with an L, which means lane violation. And the second time for wheeling or stepping on the line is a DQ, regardless of whether or not there's a material advantage been gained or not. Okay, Jerry. And again, for races not completely run in lane, stepping over the line is a DQ, but it's not a DQ if some part of the foot or shoe or wheel is still in contact with the line. If that occurs, then it is a disqualification. Okay, Jerry? For races not completely run in lanes, and if no material advantage is gained, one step on or over the line is not necessarily a DQ. And again, this would be for an 800 meters or the beginning of a split start for 5,000 or 10,000 meter race. Okay. So here's an example where the guide is finishing. The guide is on the outside of the athlete because you can tell the athlete, and it's a T11 race, the athlete is finishing before the guide. So that's something you need to watch for. Next, Jerry. Another picture of a guide and athlete. And again, the guide is running on the outside of the athlete and the guide is finishing before the athlete. Now, in World Para Athletics, this is actually the call of it can be the call of the track referee, but it's usually the call of the chief judge of photo finish if an athlete finishes after the guide, because the chief judge of photo finish has these kinds of images to work with. Okay, Jerry, next. And these are where an athlete and guide are not tethered. You can see in the first athlete, you can see his arm is dangling back, and you can see the guide holding the tether. And so the guide has finished and the athlete has finished, but they're not tethered together. And in the second image, you cannot see whether the guide and athlete have released the tether. So the benefit of the doubt with the second athlete and guide go to them. Okay. And another image of where an athlete and guide are not tethered. They've released the tether before the athlete finishes. Okay, Jerry. For just one comment on road events, there isn't always a call room, but there should be for elite athletes. And I believe Jennifer's going to talk about that. A T11 must run with a guide and they must use the tether properly, but the tether can be longer. So as I mentioned earlier, the maximum length is 50 centimeters versus 30 centimeters for track events. They must use the tether properly and the guide cannot finish before the athlete. It's also important to note that athletes do not need to wear eye patches or eye masks or opaque glasses in T11 road events. Now, here's an example. This is, in fact, an example from a marathon. And the example is, if you look at this image, and this is actually one that I was asked to comment on, who makes the decision and how can you tell if an athlete or guide has finished first? And in this case, the image may have been taken from behind as opposed to exactly beside. So the finish line itself might be unusually wide, if you will. And you cannot see the athlete. So your first impression would be that it's the guide finishing before the athlete. And that was certainly the decision in this case. But the decision is made. Who makes the decision? It's the track referee or off-track referee in this case. And that decision was overruled by the jury of appeal because they couldn't tell where the image was actually taken from, if it was a photo finish image or if it was just a camera image. Okay, Jerry, next. So guides must not push, pull, or propel the athlete at any time during a running event. And here's and the example is here. Just watch this. We're going to play this a couple of times. So this is a guide and athlete in Rio, and they're from China, and it's the semifinals of the 100 meter for women. So you can see the note says sometimes it's way more obvious. Okay, start it, Jerry, and we'll stop it at the UK athlete and guide.
So watch their arms, right?
Yeah. And in this case, watch the shoulder of the athlete from the UK.
And watch him grab her hand.
And in Rio, it was acceptable to have a tether that's more closely secured to the athlete hand. So in this case, so how can you tell? Well, in this case, you're watching the shoulder of the athlete, and you can see the shoulder of the athlete is jerking up and down. So the cadence of the event is being dictated by the guide rather than the athlete. Who makes the decision? It's the track referee would make the decision. But in this case, it could also be made by the video referee if there's video evidence of it. And again, sometimes it's way more obvious. In this case, it was not very obvious, but I was the track referee in Rio and I disqualified the athlete, and the athlete was reinstated by the jury of appeal. And then the same athlete and guide did something similar in the final, but it wasn't quite the same thing. It was actually perfect running style, and I did not disqualify the athlete or the guide. And the jury asked me why I didn't, and I just said, well, it was perfect running form in the final, but not in the semifinal. Okay, next, Jerry. I think we're going to get into guide exchanges pretty soon.
Yeah.
So for a 5,000 meter and 10,000 meter races, T12 and T11 athletes may use two guides. If they do, they must declare on which lap they will exchange guides, and note it's on the back straight. And if they declare but don't exchange guides, then they will be disqualified. Okay, Jerry, play
Okay,
this
it's
one.
running.
And you can, well, you don't see it, but
first time watching this in 4 years, maybe your first time watching this
you can
overall.
see the guide moving
The
in now,
athlete has to cross the line
and he
first at the
gets
finish.
between
Ahead
the
of the guard,
athlete
otherwise
and the
it's disqualification.
current guide, and they do a what I call a good guide exchange. And then there's another, so you can see you will see the athlete coming in, the guide coming in shortly, and then running between the athlete and the guide, the current guide. And so here's the athlete coming into the image now. Now, it's not likely that we will see this at our national championships, but it's possible. It's possible to have a 5,000 meter T11 or T12 with a guide exchange.
He has to cross the line first at the finish, ahead of the guide, otherwise it's disqualification.
And of course, those tethers would be illegal now, right, David?
Correct. Okay, let's look at the next image, the next video, Jerry.
Okay.
And this is another guide exchange, and I've called this a bad guide exchange. And this also happened at Rio. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the guide. You can see the guide running into the image, into the picture. He should be running in shortly. You can see his elbow there.
You can see the runner there standing on the track.
Yep.
Yeah, the new extra guide.
So you can see the new guide coming into the race. And it's difficult to see whether or not.
There he is right there.
You can see the athlete and the guide, and you can see another guide now, but you don't see the guide exchange. See the guide come in and then the guide going out. Okay, Jerry, next slide, please. So a note on T11 and T12 and T13, as well as T20. Those are the only groups that must use starting blocks linked to the start information system. So it's compulsory, as is a crouch start for races less than 800 meters, including the first leg of a 4x400, or it could be the universal relay as well. T13 athletes are often considered as able-bodied for the purposes of the start, and no guide runner is allowed, so that's no option for a T13 to have a guide runner. Only T12 athletes may have a guide runner, but T11 athletes must have a guide runner. T20 athletes may request assistance to set their blocks, and where possible, the assistance would be most probably one of the officials, i.e. a starter's assistant at the start line. The assistant, if not a starter's assistant, must retreat from the field of play when the blocks are set. This is something that we could see in the T20 400, 200 meters and 400 meters at our national championships, because there is an athlete who usually has his mother set the starting blocks for him. And for any of the starters assistants who are listening to the presentation, the athlete is Holden Gill. So it's something to be very cautious of and very common to watch for that event. Call room schedule and scheduled pre-inspection. So there's normally a scheduled pre-inspection for racing chairs, race runners, helmets, and throwing frames. And the pre-inspection is done outside of the competition. It's usually done 1 or 2 days before the competition. And it's usually done by ITOs, or it could be done by call room staff and starters assistants or ITOs. And usually, again, it's 1 or 2 days before the meet. And that allows the athlete and or his team to make changes to the equipment if it's found to be defective. And the equipment should be in a locked, secured area that all equipment is placed in. Now, it's also important to note that the day of competition, that racing chairs, race running frames, helmets are re-inspected by call room staff. Plus, there is an inner ear canal inspection done. And that's to ensure that the athlete is not wearing a communication device. With throwing frames, if there is an issue with a frame, then 2 call room judges or the event referee will go to the event site and do another inspection of the equipment if they're called to do one. And I've seen this happen at World Championships where people didn't like the throwing frame of one of the athletes, so they complained about it. So another inspection was done prior to the athlete getting on the device or the throwing frame and making his or her throws. Okay, Jerry, next slide. Helmets. So for all wheelchair races and for the T71, 72 race runners, they all must wear helmets. The wearing of the helmet is compulsory, and they must leave the call room wearing it, and they must wear helmets on the warm-up track if there is a warm-up track. And there's a technical specification for the helmets, and you can see that in the lower bullet. Okay, Jerry? Racing chairs that have a speedometer that has a GPS component may be allowed to be used as long as the communication function is not included in the device or it's turned off. So that means that you can look, call room staff have to be able to determine whether or not the GPS is on or off. And it's not always easy to determine that. So wheelchairs must have 2 large rear wheels, maximum of 70 centimeters, and 1 smaller front wheel, which is 50 centimeters. They're also allowed on each side 1 round push rim, which is allowed for each of the large wheels. And they must have a functioning braking and steering system for safety purposes. And only hand-operated mechanical devices are allowed. So no mirrors, nothing of that nature is allowed. Okay, Jerry?
As
So-
David said, indeed, no mirrors are allowed. The height to the bottom of the frame can't be any more than 50 centimeters. And there must be a seat. And you'll see a lot of very interesting machinations about how people design their seating in racing chairs. Many of them will have kind of a sling, and the current, not preferred necessarily, but you see it primarily. It allows them to sit on top of their legs. Their lower leg gets tucked underneath them, and that gets them up and over those wheels, and it actually provides them with a little bit more of a mechanical advantage. No fairings or similar devices like you see on racing cars. The whole idea is these athletes should be getting the chair to move around, and there shouldn't be any aerodynamic aid to improve their performance. David indicated that we can't have communication devices, which are sometimes incorporated into those GPS devices. As long as it's turned off, it's okay to keep it on there, but certainly it's something we have to check when we do our inspections for the chairs and frame runners for that matter. The seats can have side guards. That usually is used to kind of keep the clothing, or if the athlete is a little bit bigger and they don't quite fit the chair quite well, it keeps some of their skin from rubbing in the wheels. So it's more of a safety thing than anything else. Nothing may protrude from behind the back of the rear wheels. I'll tell you why in a second. But the easy way to check that is if you have a vertical wall somewhere, you back the chair up to it. If the rear wheels hit the wall before anything sticking out from the frame, then that's okay. But if it bumps into a piece of frame before it hits the wheels, that athlete does not meet standard and could potentially get a yellow card for the first offense. Basically, one of the reasons why they have that piece of frame sticking out from behind those wheels is to prevent drafting. In the old days, people used to stick their front wheel right up in between the rear wheels of the athlete in front of them, and you could see the difference. The athlete in front might be, pushing 15 times a minute, and the athlete in back might be pushing on their wheelchair 1 or 2 times. But you can imagine the propensity for having a crash when you're doing that. So that's why this rule was put into effect. At the start line, you can't put your lower extremities on the surface of the track. Some of these athletes, especially the amputees, may have one limb that's functional. They can't use that limb to help push them and get them going from the start. So keep an eye. The starters and starters' assistants should be watching out for that. It doesn't happen all that often, but every once in a while you will see it. The incline plane of the racing chair. All racing chairs have camber. It makes it a little bit easier to turn it, especially when you're going around the curves. And you can see that line is on the surface of the push rim. Again, that push rim, you're only allowed one. If you had more than one on there of different diameters, it would be like being able to change gears, and that's a mechanical advantage. But no part of the interior part of the frame can stick out beyond that level, that surface of the push rim on the side there. So you can't be like the old chariot races where you had those big spikes sticking out from outside those wheels. Athletes do not use blocks. T31s, the 34s, they're in racing chairs. That makes a lot of sense. However, we will talk about frame runners in a minute, and that's a little bit different. All athletes racing in chairs must wear their helmets, also on the warm-up track if there is one. Some other considerations: when time allows, and only on circular races, we often will allow a heat to go around the track once. Maybe make sure that their compensators are set. For those of you who don't quite understand what a compensator is and haven't been around racing chairs much, it's a mechanical device that allows them to dial in the angle of turn in the front wheel. And there are 2 positions, straight ahead or slightly turned. They've got 2 positions they can hit. If you watch the race, you'll see the athletes coming down the straightaway, and just as they get to that turn, you'll see the athletes reach up and slap a handle. That handle pops it to the left, and it makes it much easier to be able to push around in a curve because then you can just push in equal force on both wheels and not have to push harder on the outside wheel to make your chair turn. And every racing chair I've ever seen has that on it. So it'll be something that will be very, very common. And next, that would, what's to watch for at the start. We have a picture coming up here in a second, but you know, able-bodied individuals or ambulatory individuals in parasport must have their hands behind the starting line for the start. In the case of a wheelchair or a racing chair or a frame runner, the center of the axle inside the hub of the front wheel must be behind the starting line. As a result, however, if you look at this picture again, a whole lot of that front wheel is going to be over the starting line. But the reason we do that is if we look at the center of the hub and keep it behind the starting line, that center of the hub is what the finish is called. So it's the same point at the start and the finish. And again, feet can't touch the ground at the start. Here we go. You see this picture up here, a couple of chairs lined up at the starting line here. The yellow lines here are just at the edge of the white starting line there. If you look at the top one, you can see the hub, and you can see the center hub where I'm pointing with my arrow right there. That's the center of the hub. That has to be behind the starting line. And you can see it's a significant amount behind the starting line. He's okay, or she. If you look at one down here, you look, and now this center of this hub, you look at this one, it's actually touching the edge of that white line. So if you were the starting assistant, you might kind of walk down the line and check this, maybe ask this one athlete right here to back up just a little bit before the start. Again, see, you've got all that wheel sticking out in front of that. That's perfectly fine. One other point is if you look at the center of this hub up here and you go straight down to the surface of the track, that is the only point at which that wheel is touching the track. So that's why we use the center of the hub as a guide to make sure that some part of the wheel is behind it. Otherwise, we'd have to have that chair shoved all the way back. Makes it an easy mark. David, I think you'd probably agree photo finish is a lot easier doing it that way, this way?
Yes, yes.
Okay, what to watch for at the start again? At the set command, the more functional classes are probably pretty safe. They'll be sitting back there. They'll call them up at set. The one movement you will see for most of these athletes is they're going to lift their arms up and come up over their rear wheels and hold that position until the gun goes off. That's perfectly okay. It gives them an advantage to start. It also keeps them from popping that front wheel up when they really shove on their racing chair really hard. And yeah, that's pretty much it. They're kind of fun to watch them start. Everybody has a little bit different twist to how they start. This is an old picture. The one thing I'll point out is this guy is illegal. He's not wearing a helmet. But here it is. You're sitting back here on your marks. Come up to the mark. The set command. You see he's got his elbows up. Some athletes will get even higher up like that. And then bang, the gun goes off and off they go. Picture is worth 1,000 words. David, I think you're on now.
Okay. And other considerations for wheelchair races, starters should probably position a recaller 50 meters up the race, up the track for races longer than 800 meters. So that would be starting at the 1,500 meters. And that is if something happens, if there's a crash in the first 50 meters, a starter can recall the event or a recaller can recall the event. And again, the good practice is the starter continues to follow the athletes visually for the first 50 meters. And a recaller is usually placed 50 meters away from the start, looking back towards the start line, watching for any collisions and having the opposite view to the starter. and the start referee should be close to the starter in cases of problems that occur. Okay, Jerry, next slide.
David, correct me if I'm wrong, that the starter has the opportunity to DQ someone if he thinks it's necessary in that case, or just recall the whole group, right?
Yes, the starter can recall the whole race and just recall it and start it again, or can start it with or without someone. If an athlete is the one who created the crash, then the athlete could be disqualified, and that would be by the starter or the start referee.
Thank you. It's a new
Now,
sport.
the reason for this picture is because the finish is the axle of the leading wheel for wheelchairs and race runners. And what is the leading wheel? Is it the front wheel or is it the leading wheel, as in this case? The leading wheel happens to be on the inside of the track. And so you have to use your second camera to get that image. And you can see the finish of this race. The times would be here for the one athlete, the second athlete, and where it's marked, where the line is for the first athlete. Okay. And for this is somewhat similar but simple to deal with. It's the athletes look like they're going in a different direction, but that's just the orientation of the photo finish system. And you will see the finish line now, their times. So it's a fairly close race. So we have time for another question or two before we continue, if you wish.
I think you've been answering them in the chat. There's a question from Ian.
There was a question from Carol Cull about what happens if an athlete steps on the line once in each lap of a multi-lap event. For example, a 1,500 meter race. Well, if it happens twice in one race, then the second time the person is disqualified. But if it only happens once, then it's recorded on the finish sheet as with an L, and for the start sheet for the second event or second heat of the multi event, it might be recorded as an L for a lane violation. Any other questions?
It looks like Ian has his hand up, but I don't think the attendees can. Oh,
I can't see it.
Okay, Ian, go ahead.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, super. Okay, when you're in the starting blocks with a guide, the slide you showed us from Rio where you actually DQ'd the Brits, the Chinese fella, they had their hands overlapping. The athlete had his hand on top of the guide's hand. Is that
Yes,
legal?
that's not allowed any longer. It used to be allowed.
Okay, it was, yeah, I don't know if you can see the picture, yeah. Okay, so that, it was quite clear on that one.
Yeah, that rule was changed in Rio. There was a meeting of a group of people in Rio relating to VI athletes, and the decision. This particular image is what Ian's talking about.
Yeah, it was quite clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question, Dave. The other night we had a starter Zoom, and one of the scenarios we saw, we had athletes, it was a para race, 6 athletes were using their blocks crouching and one was standing. Is that permitted now?
Yes, there are only certain races where they must use blocks, And those are athletes in T11, 12, 13, and 20. Other athletes can use blocks if they want, but they're not linked to a start information system, and they don't necessarily have to use them.
So in a race like that, though, if there's some using blocks and some not, would any of the blocks be started hooked to the SIS system?
No, none of them would be.
So none of them would be, right?
No, and they shouldn't be.
Great
So
question.
if there was a second heat of the same categories, would that heat or section go without the SIS as well?
Correct,
Yeah, thank you.
because it's only the T11, 12, 13, and 20 that must use starting blocks.
Right.
So others, it's optional.
Good, thank you.
Okay,
You know, David, one point, and it just popped into my mind when you said that, is that if you have a guide and you're in the blocks, the guide has to use blocks too.
that's correct.
I mean, I've seen a few cases where the guide stands up and is ready to run because he's a big, fast athlete and he's just being the guide. You
Right.
have to get down blocks.
Yeah, and the starter's assistant should be putting blocks behind the guide and telling the guide that he must use the starting blocks. So the guide and the athlete must use starting blocks in certain cases. Okay, if there are
One
no
question.
further questions, we'll carry on and we
There was
can.
one more, David,
yeah.
just from Bill about, I think you might have covered this earlier, but if an athlete does have a lane violation, that's recorded on the sheet with an L for the next rounds of the competition?
Correct.
Okay.
Sorry, I lost my place, Dave.
It's back just a bit.
That's where we were, isn't it? No, no.
Back a little bit. I think
You should
that's
be
where
on
we
slide
were.
62.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there we go.
okay, and I think you're taking over until just before the end, Jerry.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. Let me pop this up full screen. I'm going to show you some pictures and actually a short movie about race running. Race running is an old term, and once we have the classification rules set down and implemented, the new term is frame running. Everybody races, so saying race running, everybody runs, so it just didn't seem to quite fit the modality by which they get around the track, so they changed the term to frame running. What to watch at the start? Very much like racing chairs. You're in the call room, you got to make sure all the appropriate measurements are there. The running frames are significantly bigger than that, and we'll show you in a second. They'll probably be already lined up and on their marks. It's not that typical, you're sitting back, and then when you're called up, you move to your mark. Most of these athletes will be right there before the starting line. They might be an inch or so behind it, but their ability to move and get around is a little bit shaky. You know, a lot of these guys have some spasticity that makes it hard for them to stay still. So they'll maybe back away from the line just a little bit to keep them from false starting. Some of these athletes can use starting blocks. And it's interesting. What do you mean? They're using a mechanical device, but they're actually standing and just leaning forward on a pad. So they can put a block, they can use both, you have 1 foot, 2 feet, or no blocks. It's strictly up to them. Both feet don't have to be in contact with the blocks. They could have both pads there and they just have 1 foot on the block. That's perfectly fine. Again, the start and finish is gauged by the center of the axle of the front wheel, just like we talked about before. Frame runner athletes must also wear helmets. whether they're on the warm-up track or whether when they're leave the call room, they have to have those helmets on. And really a good practice to have is to have the starter's assistant walk the line and check those front wheels and make sure that everybody is also settled in. It may take a little bit longer to get these guys lined up, and women, of course, and get ready to do their start. So have a little patience.
Now, it's also important to note that Canada does not have any frame runners at this stage.
I think the U.S. has 5.
Yeah, and we may get some, but we don't have any yet.
Yeah. If you go to Europe, they have entire clubs that are frame running clubs. It's amazing. This is actually this is Berlin.
Berlin in
yeah.
2018.
Right. So everybody's lined up. Again, you may notice where these reddish orange arrows are, those are the athletes with blocks. The one here with my pointer that athlete is using both blocks. This one right here where I'm pointing at, their left foot is on a block and the other one is on the track. So that's an example of what we were just talking about. And a typical start, an internationally this is Bydgoszcz in Poland, internationally sanctioned track. Its measurements are fit international standards, so they're 1.22 meters wide. So as you can see, these frame runners are a little bit wider than a racing chair, but it's still reasonable to ask them to be in this width of a lane. Sometimes, and particularly in the United States, at some universities, but mostly at high schools and colleges, instead of 1.22, they're 1.069 meters, which that's 6 inches narrower than this track right here. So when that happens, it's pretty unreasonable to expect these athletes to not DQ all the time when they go on these really narrow lanes. So one option that you do have is to do just like you do for the blind. You assign these athletes 1, 3, 5, and 7, and give them 2 lanes, and you extend the lane from the odd number lane into the even lane, just like you do for able-bodied or visually impaired athletes. I'm sorry, and we've done that every once in a while, just so you know that's an option. You can see they're all kind of leaning on a chair. That guy was sitting. Chest is on the chair. Chest is on the seat there. Chest is on the seat right there. He's got a little pad. One thing that the International Paralympic Committee and World Para-Athletics is a proponent of is providing mechanisms and the means by which athletes with more severe disabilities can compete. And this is a classic example of it. Some smart guy somewhere in Europe came up with an idea for these. I think it might have been in Belgium. And they become more and more popular. And I think it's a great event.
Actually, Jerry, it started in Denmark.
Denmark, okay. That's close. Belgium, Denmark.
Yeah.
Lower limb impairments. The athletes with prostheses, the 61, 62s, 63s, 64s, and the athletes without a prostheses, that they still have their limbs, the 42s through 44s. Again, the lower numbers are essentially less functional. Their functional impairment is greater than the higher numbers. These athletes may use starting blocks if they wish. But again, like we were just talking, and those were great questions about, whether you're hooking up to the SIS, you shouldn't do that because there may be somebody that doesn't want to, and it wouldn't be fair to have that extra information on some and not others. A crouch start, is not required. Athletes can request assistance to get them to the start, and they can request assistance to set their blocks. There is a form in the call room if they have an idea of exactly what notch on the block mechanism they want their foot pads, et cetera, done. They can draw out a quick little mat, and that information is handed to the starting crew, and they can step in and help the athlete set their blocks. If the athletes, again, do use blocks, they don't have to take up a 4-point stance, obviously. I'll show you an example of something here in a picture, and they can only use one pad if they want. Lower limb impairments for the 61s through the 64s. 61s and 62 athletes are bilaterally amputated athletes, and they have a prosthetic limb, either one or two. And the difference between a 61 and a 62, the 61 is bilateral above the knee, a 62 is bilateral below the knee, the 63 is single amputation above the knee, and a 64 is a single amputation below the knee. And again, that 64 only has an amputation below the knee, so he's pretty stable and kind of normal if you think about it. And they can really blow out of the box with a lot of strength. The T61s, those bilateral above the knees athletes, they look really awkward. And the first time you see one of these guys, and I'll show you a picture, bend over and put his hands on the track and start, it's just like, how do they do that? But as a starter, you may have to hold that gun for a little bit and let them settle in, because it's like standing on two poles with your, you have no limb from maybe your hip down, and you've got these two prosthetic limbs, and there's no knee. They're straight poles. On wet tracks, you can imagine that there might be a tendency for these athletes as they're going around a curve and say a 200-meter event. It's a little slippery out there, and it's easy for them to slip and fall. The 61 athletes tend to, like I said, don't bend at the knee. Their prosthesis is not often designed that way to be able to flex. And here's an example. You can see they all have their rear ends way up in the air, and there's no way that they can get down with two hands and stand and get on the ground like that. I've seen people try and they just fall over face first. But that's a stable position. It just takes them a moment or two to get into it. So as a starter, be aware of that and have a little patience with them. Sometimes you just kind of got to make a judgment, and when you think they're all ready, go ahead and give them the gun. David?
Yes, now a little bit about relays. So all athletes need to start their running or wheeling within their exchange zone. It's the same as ambulant or ambulatory athletes. They all have to start within their exchange zone. And exchange zones for wheelchair athletes are 40 meters and 30 meters for all other groups. Different exchange, baton or touch at different points. The first exchanges, 1 and 2, this is for
Universal.
This is for the universal relay. The exchanges 1 and 2 are ambulatory, therefore the athletes get 30-meter exchange zones. But the last is a wheelchair, therefore the last exchange zone is 40 meters. And the universal relay is the one that we're using at our national championships. And it is mixed gender and mixed sport class. And you'll see what that means in probably 2 slides.
Yeah.
So all athletes need to start their running or wheeling within their exchange zone as noted. A baton is used for T11, T12, and T20 races only. And there won't be a T11 or T12 race in Langley this summer. Passing is by touch only for other classes and for the universal relay. And that is because in the universal relay, there are athletes who do not need to have limbs or are in wheelchair, and the wheelchair is by touch only. And it's the touch that determines a valid exchange, just like the passing of a baton is the exchange. A touch is a valid exchange. Okay, next slide, Jerry. So the 2 men, 2 women, and the sport classes, so it's mixed gender, mixed class. And the running order is the first leg is either a T11, T12, or T13 visually impaired athlete. The second leg is an amputee, either upper limb or lower limb, with or without prosthesis. The third leg is a standing or ambulatory cerebral palsy, brain injury, or someone with a balance disorder. And the fourth leg is a wheelchair, either a T33, 34, or a T51 to 54. Now, what's important though is that no more than 2 athletes from sport class T13, T46, 47, or T38, or a T54 athlete are allowed. And that's because you don't want the higher functioning athletes, which are the higher numbers, to be dictating what happens in the events. Okay, Jerry, next. For all athletes after their event, whether it's a field event or a track event, once it's over, they need to exit the field of play and go into the post-event control center. And we do have one set up, or there will be one set up at our national championships. And usually it's a tent near the finish line. And in fact, it's behind the start line, the call room tent. And it's where the athlete would go to pick up their accreditation and anything else they left in the call room. They will usually also have to go through a media or past a media scrum, and they always do at major competitions. So the media would basically line, would be a little bit like a gauntlet for athletes, but it's not that bad. It doesn't take that long. Okay, next slide, Jerry. Just as a summary for following the athletes, there's a lot to watch for in track events, especially with T11, T12 athletes. So there's starting, there's also running out of lane, there's obstruction, there's pushing and pulling by guide, there's finishing, and there are guide exchanges. So in terms of finishing, again, they have to use a tether, and they cannot release the tether until both athlete and guide are past the vertical plane of the finish line. Okay, Jerry, next. So this is not your last chance to ask questions, but this is another formal question period. And I believe there is one question in the, it's called Rules for Wheelchair and Frame Running. Are they the same for the start line, the center of the axle behind the line? And the answer is yes. Any other questions or any hands up?
Ian has his hand up here. I'll just.
Okay. Go for it, Ian.
I have no experience with para relays. Will we have some in Langley, do you think?
We're having a universal relay in Langley.
And what distance is that?
The distance for universal relay is always a 4x100 meters.
Okay, so when we go, is there wheelchairs in that one?
Yes, the wheelchair is the.
So is that the 40 meters? Is that 10 meters added to the end of the regular exchange zone?
It's usually added at the beginning.
Okay, so that means, all right, gotcha. So you said usually, does it matter?
Yeah, this is the, here, if you can see the slide, I put it back up. This is the running order of the event.
Okay.
So you got the visually impaired first, lower limb disability with and without prosthesis, and upper limb disability in the second leg. And the third leg is typically the PCP, but sometimes brain injury, the standing CP classes, not the wheelchair ones. And in the fourth leg, it can be the seated CP athletes, the 33s and 34s, or it can be the typical spinal cord injury is the classic example of what a 51 through 54 is. And of course, like David said, it's a 40-meter exchange zone. But this is why they don't have a baton, as you can see. The amputees can't carry one, and the wheelchair guys can't reach out back behind them and grab a baton. And the visually impaired guys can't really see to do it, so it makes it pretty difficult. But the touch is easy to see.
Thank you.
And I think, Ian, you said, you asked a question, where do you add the 10 meters? And the 10 meters is always added at the beginning of the exchange zone for the
Oh, great
wheelchair
question.
athletes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Hey, David, I have a question.
yep.
What happens if an athlete, an amputee athlete, loses their prosthesis going down the track before the finish line?
Well, an athlete must finish the race with the prosthesis. So the athlete must pick up the prosthesis and either reaffix it and finish the race with it on, or tuck it under their arm and they can hop down the finish line. And it used to be they couldn't hop, but now they can.
Thanks, David.
Okay. Another great question.
Looks like
Okay,
Question?
question from Connie. What constitutes a touch? Well, a touch is usually Jerry, touch your back or touch your front. So
On your head, on the helmet,
you can
touch
touch
them.
anywhere,
Anywhere.
and any of the two athletes can touch the other athlete. It's just a touch must be made. And a touch is the equivalent of a baton. So where the touch occurs, it must occur within the exchange zone. Does that answer your question, Connie? Okay, now if you have any other questions, feel free to send them to either myself or Jerry. We'll be happy to answer them and help with any World Para Athletics questions you may have. And that even includes you, Louise.